Good afternoon, everyone. We're so happy to welcome you to our 2020 Advancing Diversity Black Entrepreneurship series. And this is a series, so there are three parts. This is the first one. Harvard Alumni Entrepreneurs, better known as HAE, is a global community with 15 chapters worldwide, connecting over 14,000 Harvard alumni over entrepreneurship and innovation. You can join by registering at harvardae.org. So my name is Jill Johnson, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Institute for Entrepreneurial Leadership. I'll be serving as your moderator for today's discussion, Black Entrepreneurship in America, a Historical Perspective. So first, I'd like to thank our sponsors who have made this possible. Arcturus Impact Investors, Fortis Lux Financial, Harvard Club of Boston, Harvard Business School Association of Boston, Morris, On River HR, SAP-IO Foundries, and Sophia. Thank you so much to all of our sponsors. So two quick housekeeping notes before we get started. We've prepared a toolkit with resources and information that will help you to do a deeper dive into this topic. So we'll be sending that out sometime following either this presentation or, we may collect some more resources and send them out after the third. We hope you'll be joining us for all three. And we'll send that along with a contact list to all the attendees who joined the mailing list. So hopefully you did join the mailing list so that you'll be connected with all the people who are involved in this conversation. And what we hope is that you will actually take action, use that resource list to take action. Second, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat box, not into the Q&A, but into the chat box to HAE only. We'll get to as many questions as we can. And so now I think we're ready to go. And without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists for today. So joining us, we have James Lowry, Jim, who is a business icon, sought after speaker, strategic advisor, and nationally recognized workforce and supplier diversity expert and pioneer. Jim was the first African-American consultant for global consulting at McKinsey & Company in 1968. Later, he became the first African-American senior partner at the prestigious Boston Consulting Group, where he led the firm's workforce diversity, ethnic marketing, and minority business development consulting practice. He continues to serve as a senior advisor to BCG while heading his own private consulting firm, James H. Lowry and Associates. We are so glad to have him with us today. Next, we have Ron Mitchell, who's a serial entrepreneur and a good friend. He's founded multiple technology businesses in the human capital space. Most recently, Ron founded and served as the CEO of Virgil Holdings, Inc., which owns and operates H Careers, the leading talent recruitment platform in the hospitality industry, and Virgil Careers, a career assessment and analytics platform. We're very excited to have Ron with us as well. And last but not least, Susan Smith Richardson. She's a longtime journalist, news editor, and publisher. Currently, she serves as CEO of the Center for Public Integrity, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan investigative news organization. She has written widely on the media, public policy, and questions of justice in both the newsroom and society. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. So let's get started. Let's jump right into this conversation. I'd like for you each to briefly, just if there's anything else you want to say about yourself, please say it and tell us what you do. And then I'd like you to share what you believe to be the primary barrier to Black entrepreneurial growth. And Jim, why don't we start with you?
Okay. I'll try and be brief, but first I'd like to say I'm so glad to be a part of this, and I'm so proud of what you and Regina are doing. So anytime I can help you in any way, I will do it. But briefly, I've been in this space for over 40 years. When I designed the first federal government policy program, which ended up being a division of the Department of Commerce, and I said new strategy for minority businesses. Then I designed the first, I think, private sector diversity program and minority business for Pepsi. And I guess the one I've taken the most pride in from the private sector is we designed a program for Ford Motor Company, and it was the first corporate entity to ever do over $1 billion with minority businesses. So I put all that experience in and I wrote a book on it, and I'm very proud of what we've been doing, but I would agree with what all of you have said before. We haven't done enough. And if I were to say why we haven't moved the needle enough, I think there are about 2 or 3 things. One, I think discrimination in the early stages when I started in 1978 was a real factor. But I think right now the real issue is I don't think Blacks are being exposed to the opportunities and the deals that could help us accelerate. I think too, looking back over a 40-year period of time, I think corporate America stole our best and our brightest. Because I remember when I recruited at Harvard many years ago, there were a few people on campuses. I saw the population went up. And then all of a sudden, Wall Street, consulting firms, and other corporations stole our best. And because they were there, and I can't blame them, that they didn't go into entrepreneurship as they should have. And I think the last one, which might be controversial, was I think in our community, we've never embraced entrepreneurship like we should have in the free enterprise system. And therefore, we were discouraged from being entrepreneurs. And we really didn't give the kudos we should have to the outstanding entrepreneurs who really made this country very important and to create more. So I think there are about 3 major reasons why that we have not moved as quickly as we should have.
Thank you. Susan, same question.
Thank you also for having me here. I feel like I'm entering this space from a really different point of view. I am a first-time CEO of a news organization. This is an industry that, as you have all read, is in tremendous flux and under a whole lot of pressure. Our business model is floundering. That is tied to revenue, but revenue very much is tied to people wanting to read or engage with the information you have. So I'm in a space that is very much in a tough position. But I want to connect that back to what we're talking about today. And there are a couple of points I want to make, some to piggyback on what Jim said, and some to kind of take us to a different direction. I would certainly agree that access and networks are important. As someone who works in a space where there aren't Black people who look like me or women of color in many leadership positions, it's clear that there needs to be access, networks, etc. But what we're also seeing right now, and I'm going to talk really here as a journalist, is a confluence of a set of inequalities that are just coming full circle in the country through everything we've been experiencing in the last several months with the coronavirus pandemic. The disproportionate impact, and I'll just speak to African Americans here, although we know the coronavirus is having a massive impact on the Latinx community, but we have a disproportionate health impact on African Americans. We're also seeing a tremendous economic impact of this coronavirus crisis on African Americans as well. And what's coming together, and then the policing issues around violence, what's all coming together is really history coming full circle and laying bare a number of systemic inequalities and structural inequalities that I think the country has not resolved and is not addressed. How I think these tie into our question today about a historical perspective and opportunities for entrepreneurship is simply this. We have both a question of wages, people losing income because they're unemployed, but also the fact that those who are working don't have the ability to kind of weather the storm. That's the assets, to be able to go into the bank for 3 or 4 months to deal with their rent or to pay their mortgage. That's a question of a racial wealth gap. So I think part, for me, of the struggle with entrepreneurship is really having that legacy of wealth. And as part of the systemic racism and structural inequality in this country, some of that legacy of wealth has not been available to African Americans. And I think that has an impact clearly on entrepreneurship. The other part that this speaks to me too, is not just what the economy does, but also the role of government as a regulator of, distributing wealth and privilege. And what we also, I think,
Susan, I want to hold you. I want to hold you on that point a bit, because that's a major topic we're going to come back and discuss.
Right. So. But I just want to hold down on that as the other issue I think that we need to address, and that is a barrier to entrepreneurship. It's a set of government laws and also policies.
Absolutely. And I assure you, we are going to drill down on that some more. Ron, let's get you in here with your initial thoughts and just anything else you want to add about your background.
Great. Well, thank you, Jill, for inviting me here. And it's great to have this audience and certainly the panelists here to talk about this subject, which is near and dear to me. I am born of an entrepreneur. So I grew up in an entrepreneurial household when my father was an entrepreneur, started his own firm in the 1970s, early 70s. I followed suit and started my entrepreneurial ventures really in the early 2000s. And so, what's the difference here? What's been the hindrance, I think, in sort of growth in the ecosystem of Black entrepreneurship? And I think it's that the networks and the infrastructure around entrepreneurship have not matured as quickly. Well, it's a function of one, maturity of those networks and infrastructure for Black folks, and then also access to that infrastructure and those networks. You often hear it takes a village. Well, as an entrepreneur, it absolutely takes a village. And those networks are networks not only for capital. And, you heard mention of, access to wealth. It's very challenging to start these early stage entrepreneurial ventures without early stage capital. And if we don't have those in our communities and we don't have the networks in order to access those, and there are other systemic things that inhibit our access, then that's a challenge. The other is access to people. And you will find that those that are investing in entrepreneurs, particularly the professional investors in the venture capital and private equity space, are going to look deeply into the teams that have been come together to collaborate. And you'll find that we don't have access to a lot of those people networks that enable us to raise the types of capital very early on, like folks at Facebook and Google can. And then the other really important element here is access to support, and that support infrastructure is sort of very critical, from advisors to even groups like YPOs and such that provide the sort of institutional support for entrepreneurs that we often don't have access to. I mean, these are sort of critical, these are critical elements of what causes people to be successful or not as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Ron, we've talked about our parents both owning business. My parents had a newspaper publishing business, and these were the issues that they talked about all the time. They had a publication called the Minority Business Journal. So I grew up listening to these conversations around access to capital, access to resources, et cetera. Jim, I want to go to you for a minute now. And let's talk about the fact that these conversations are the same conversation that we've been having for many, many years now. And there have been a lot of programs. You were instrumental in creating a lot of those programs. Why aren't we further along?
Yeah, before I started on that one, I didn't know about your background, your parents' background. And Susan, you probably didn't know that I was the chairman of StimStack Enterprises, which controlled the Defender and the Pittsburgh area and the tri-state. And when you think back, and this is a partial answer,
yes,
back in the day, we took so much, pride in the entrepreneurs that we had that were coming on your newspapers, and we're not getting that, and it's played down. And I think that, one of the things I've been involved with a magazine out of Dallas to try and bring that up. But I think in terms of the programs, you made me think about that. I think there are a couple of reasons. One, I think, you know, and I'm not going to mash non-minorities, but they really didn't think that we had the capability to perform at a certain level. And you saw that with the studies that I've done and other people have done in terms of the ability of people who had asset management funds to be able to get more funds from New York Common or CalPERS and CalSTRS, and they outperformed the market. But because they were Black or brown, they said, no, they can't do it, so they're not going to allocate the funds. So I think that that's always been a part of it. I mentioned before, I think that the deals are there. The comfortability of people who've been working in these major corporations like automotive, these relationships started on golf courses and country clubs and things like that. Mm-hmm. And it's very close-knit comfortability, but it translates into major deals, major multi-year billion-dollar deals. And we weren't exposed to that. Like Ron's saying, there are different reasons. But I think also, you know, I'm at this point, and you know me well at this point, is I think we got to deal with those givens. But I think the onus is on us as Blacks to think differently on how we're going to move forward on this. So I think one of the things that we have not done historically is that we didn't think big enough. We started thinking about, you know, whatever field we're in, we're going to stop at a certain level. No, other people don't do that. Other cultures do not think that. I think that that's part of it. I think we didn't invest in one another. So we can get money from outside of our community, but we have to invest. We have trillions of dollars in buying power, trillions of dollars, but are we investing in one another? I think that's the other thing. And when we talk about research, and both of you have been in research, you know, have we done the research that we see every day coming out of Harvard, Wharton, Stanford, all these schools in terms of industry, in terms of global economics? We haven't done that. And I think the last thing, and I will say it forever and ever, is that Black people have to merge. We don't merge our companies. We have so much capacity, so much potential, but we have to share it. We cannot work in silos. So I think that these are the things. The programs, the last thing, just like, and it's a dilemma. It's been a dilemma for years. If the CEO of a major corporation doesn't see this as a priority for whatever reasons, nothing can really happen. You know, because it really stemmed from that CEO picking up the phone, calling his 6 to 10, you know, direct reports in the C-suite and say, we're going to do it. And I saw it happen at Ford. And that's why we got to $1 billion. And unfortunately, there's a new generation of CEOs, a new generation of leaders, and they don't think even like the leaders of 20 and 30 years ago. And that I see as a real problem. Now we're seeing a reflection point. Hopefully we can take advantage of it. But until the CEOs and the key people who have power, who have capital, deem this as a priority that they should be concerned with or support, we're going to have a hard time.
Yeah, you know, I think what's interesting about what you said, Jim, is, you know, you talked about the things that we need to do that we could be doing better. And, you know, I want to direct this to Ron and Susan. Do you think, though, that there has not been the acknowledgement of the role that just pure racism has played? And so there's been kind of this feeling that the businesses need to be better. The businesses need to have more education. They need to do better. And we all know that education's always good, right? We're Harvard folks. We believe in education.
Right.
However, at a point, if racism is a barrier, if you are just not viewed from the perspective that you have, that you are capable, that ends up becoming a barrier. Ron, what do you think about that?
Yeah, Jim, you raised some really good points. One, and Jill, you echoed those. One is, you know, how other people view Black entrepreneurs, and then how Black entrepreneurs view themselves. Mm-hmm. And if you look at sort of, you know, historically, you know, Black entrepreneurs, you know, were the technicians, right? They didn't actually need to raise a ton of capital, right? Because they were building business in which they themselves were the technician. That are the lawyers, the accountants, the doctors, right? They are actually the doers in their own businesses. And by doing that, you're kind of working within an area that people automatically give you credibility in because you can execute on yourself. And so you saw some businesses grow, and my father's business is one of them, and built the largest minority-owned accounting firm in the country. But, you know, and we can go into how difficult that was, and no small feat, but But it didn't require a ton of invested capital, right? Because you could build businesses from cash flow because they're service oriented and people. Then what happened, I think, is, you know, the majority communities and funding, you wound up getting funding for things that Black people thought Black people should know or might know better than us. And one example, Jill, would be like your parents, media, right? Black people, if you're, you know, the Defender, the Amsterdam News, Ebony, Essence.
Right.
These are businesses where, hey, they're serving the Black community. So we're going to give them a little bit of money, right? Because Black people know Black people, and we'll keep them in their sort of area, and they can build some very sizable businesses around that, you know, largest probably being BET that came out of it. And you see that even today in the venture community. One of the things that's incredibly frustrating to me is when venture capitalists wind up funding Black people for when technology-oriented venture capitalists wind up funding non-technology-oriented Black entrepreneurs. Not that I don't want to see those entrepreneurs get their money, because I actually do. And I give high fives in the background around any Black person that is able to raise capital. But I also am discouraged by the fact that they don't necessarily believe that we can run technology businesses.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Or that
It's out of our
right.
comfort zone. It ain't around Black people. You do see some media companies, Blavity, the Root, and things like that, that do get some funding again, but focused in a Black area where the folks who are running these businesses are more than capable to run TikToks of the world and Facebooks of the world, and don't get that type of funding. So that's the sort of external pressure that we see, and that is very limiting for, you know, African Americans and Black people to go and get, because people don't think that we can do things that ain't Black. But the other thing that Jim did reference is we got to think big. You know, I mean, that we start internalizing that.
Yeah, and that's the point of that internalization. That's the legacy of slavery, right? That we need to knowledge exists.
We start believing that we can't go out and build these things. And so, as Jim said, access to deals. The last deal I did, I went out and raised $20 million and said, you know what? I'm going to go buy this business. I didn't have a banker. I didn't do anything. I went out and raised $20 million to buy a business. But I should have raised $50 million to raise a business. $100 million to raise a business. That's what we have to be thinking about, because we do actually have not only the capabilities to do that, but if we do some of the things that Jim has laid out, we actually have the networks. And there's so much capital on the sidelines that I do believe that if we find the right deals around the right networks, we can actually go and build some pretty tremendous businesses.
And Jill, I want to just say one thing, just clarify something that I totally agree with you. The racism is there. It is structural. I'm on Zooms every week talking about structural racism and the racial gaps, the wealth gaps. It is real. And it ain't gone away when I started this 40 years ago. But I guess the point I'm trying to say is, let us deal with that realism and that given and move on and become better. Because it ain't going to go away because it's wrong. We have to be able to get power and capital and grow the Ron Mitchells so that we have 20 or 30 Robert F. Smiths to get the capital to be able to fight a better battle.
Right.
Yeah.
I
don't agree with that.
So Susan, I want you to now really talk to us to make sure that everyone on this call is on the same page about the government policies that have contributed to wealth gap issues and thus Black entrepreneurs not being able to get access to the resources.
Well, I want to start by commenting on something related to the news industry, because I think there's a parallel issue. There are two things that are happening that the country, and if people want to be profitable, they have to start addressing. And that is just a question of the country's demographics. By 2030, you know, this is going to be a country where people of color, people who came in from other countries, are going to be the majority. In the news industry, it's leading us to two big questions. And this would apply to other industries as well. We're either going to serve a select group of people and not care about a larger audience, or we're going to transform and create the type of culture and have the type of people in leadership who could serve all audiences. And I think that applies to technology and everything else, because if you only have teams that are monolithic, you're not going to have people who are capable of thinking about a next level of technology or even a next level of reinventing what news ought to be. So I think the question of racial, cultural diversity in a multiracial, multicultural America is going to push some of these issues to be addressed. But I also want to say this, I think what we've seen happen is as industries falter, in many cases, people like myself become CEOs at a moment in which industries are looking for reinvention. So we're coming in extremely difficult situations where, for-profit news organizations are failing and even nonprofits are struggling, and we're being asked to pull off a hat trick. So yes, the capabilities are there. I think we're really having to show what we always knew we could do in the most trying of economic circumstances. And I'm really speaking here extremely about what's happening in journalism and in publishing in a larger way. So I do want to talk a little bit about structural issues really quickly. I was thinking of just a couple of numbers from an interview that I did recently with Sandy Darity, who's kind of one of the leading scholars around the racial wealth gap. And there are two things that I think we just need to think about for a second in grounding our conversation. And they are about structural inequality. Black Americans are about 13% of the nation's population, but possess about 2.6% of the nation's wealth. 13% of the population, but 2.6% of the nation's wealth. And then let's just talk about the average Black household has a net worth of $800,000 lower than the average white household. Those numbers didn't develop yesterday. They developed over time through a combination of things I think we're talking about here. De jure segregation, which are laws and policies sanctioned by government, and then the kind of de facto, which is, no, we are not in mass playing golf with whoever on the golf course to make that deal. We also assume things like if you live in this neighborhood, if you live in a predominantly Black neighborhood, there's an access to relationships and networks you're not going to have. De facto and de jure are very much with us in real ways. But I just want to go back to the history quickly and just look at one piece that scholars of inequality talk about. And that's where are we going to get the capital? And in most cases, if you just go back historically, we've all been encouraged to buy a house. And what was that all about? That's the way that you begin to build that intergenerational wealth that you could pass on, to your son, your daughter, and keep it going. And in our case, because of so many policies on a federal level and a local level, access to building that kind of wealth just does not exist. So I think it's important to remember that we did not start off on on the same playing field. There was no level playing field. To Jim's point, moving forward, that isn't an excuse to say you cannot achieve certain things. But I think in this conversation, we also have to realize the ability of someone to achieve as an entrepreneur still has to be tied to ongoing changes in laws and policies. So if we think about something really, really simple, the Community Reinvestment Act, which began to take aim at redlining, as well as the Fair Housing Act, well, first the Fair Housing Act of 1968, followed by Community Reinvestment Act in 1977, these things began to address structural inequalities that affected Black people's ability to gain wealth through something as simple as home ownership. So I think we need to ground the conversation in recognizing the legacy of some of this is still here, and we need some policy solutions while we look at, showing the capabilities and developing those networks so we can go into next generation entrepreneurial positions.
The only thing I would drop real quick with Susan's statistics, which I see, I use often, but the key thing that we should take note of is you start dealing with where we are in that snapshot. The other thing is the household net worth of whites are increasing 43%, Hispanic 13%, and we're going down.
Yes.
So if we keep looking at that it's not just a static picture, it's where we are. And if we don't do something different,
Mhm.
it's people are coming out and saying we're going to have a negative net worth in X
Yes.
number of years. So that's
Exactly.
why we have to do something quick and fast and big.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yes,
no,
we
I
have
agree.
a wide, broad audience on this call. Susan, can you just really, really quickly tell everyone what redlining is? I'm finding that there are a lot of people who don't know what redlining is.
Well, essentially, these are policies that developed out of, had its origin in 1933 when
Right.
the government started providing insurance for home loans. And essentially, in order to do that, it had kind of a user manual that it gave out saying, less a way to assess high-risk loans. And it was racialized. High-risk loans were associated with communities that were predominantly African American. And this just continued in banks determining credit worthiness of African Americans for home ownership. I mean, that's the simple shorthand. And it's redlining because literally there were, circles on the map in red. Now, I've looked at some maps that show when you really get into the weeds and look at, lending in St. Louis. There's a really interesting book I was reading about that. You saw shades of colors put on the map based on risk. And that was because there were places where there could be actually an overlap between African Americans and whites, which is a whole different conversation. But redlining was literally the red ink on the map saying, this is Black folks, this is high risk. And while it is not legal now, some people argue that it is happening, but under a different name in terms of what type of loans African Americans receive.
That's right.
Yeah, and so, we will be sending out, as I mentioned, some additional information. I encourage everybody to learn more about redlining and the impact that it really has had on wealth in the Black community, and that impact then on our ability to grow Black businesses. Jim, let's talk a little bit about the power of the purse with respect to local governments and corporations. You've talked about that a lot.
Yeah. And Susan brings it up. I mean, the power of the purse, if we start dealing with government policy, as Susan wants us to talk about, and I go back to the late 70s, early 80s, when Perrin Mitchell was the congressman from Baltimore. And under Perrin, we passed more laws in the Jimmy Carter administration we did in the whole year about minority business, about Black business growth. And it was during that period of time, more minority businesses were created and more greater revenue was coming to the Black communities. We have not had that kind of leadership in Congress. We started talking about local issues and we started talking about local elected officials. I can tell you, because I'm from Chicago, plans to develop certain areas, like you're talking about redlining, they're in place like 10 years before it's actuated. So where are our elected officials doing the research or sharing with the community what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years unless we get our act together? So the power of the purse is real. And then you see the other side, which we all know, the power of lobbyists. Lobbyists are controlling the US economy. Lobbyists are controlling the elections because that's a classic example of the power of that purse. And when they start investing in politicians, be it at local, state, local level, federal level, they have a say on what's going to come out of policies, what decisions are going to be made, what legislation, and even how the legislation is going to be designed. We had empowerment zones. We had these coming out, but nobody did the homework on see how they're going to work. And they did because they knew how they could use these geographical areas, which was a law that was published by 2 Black senators. Who took advantage of that? Who's making money off of it? So there's this whole thing I keep saying, we have to work as a team, elected officials and entrepreneurs and advocates and community leaders. We have to all do our homework. We have to share the facts as they're coming out and what's coming out. And we have to be in a position to fund the Ron Mitchells of the world to take advantage of these things in the right way. And Jill, you've heard me say it before. And if our Black politicians supported minority entrepreneurs and Black entrepreneurs, they would have a different kind of funding to survive as elected officials. Because if you're getting all your funding from people who don't have your interests at heart, what kind of policy is going to come out?
Yeah, absolutely. And, let's talk about the power of the person in another way, in terms of people who are in corporations who are able to award contracts and do business. Ron, how did your father's business benefit from that?
Yeah, and I think Jim's referencing the Carter years, which were I think great for Black businesses, and a lot of Black businesses benefited from a lot of these policies that required the government to, and people hate to use these words, sort of set-asides for minorities to get contracts. I don't have a problem with that type of language because, it was so exclusionary before, and now they should be setting stuff aside and providing access to these types of opportunities. And then you had the growth in, Black mayors, whether that's Al Washington or David Dinkins. And when you had, these Black politicians in office, Blacks were able to get a piece of the pie from the government. My father's firm was the first, Black-owned firm to do the audit for the city of New York. Mm-hmm. Then there was the sort of corporate environments, and this is where I think there is an enormous amount of opportunity today. Unquestionably, the work that you see ELC has done, we have gatekeepers now, people in large corporations that control large P&Ls, right? And it's really the P&L people. So for so long, we had so many African Americans who were making their way up into large corporations, but they didn't control the money. Now we have African Americans that actually control the money. And so what we need is those folks to unlock the door, because entrepreneurs cannot build their businesses unless they are validated and have customers, right? And the more customers you get, the more validation you get, the more customers you get. And there is a friction point here. And I would tell you that the friction point is not as much as it is capital. That's certainly a friction point, but it is the real friction point is customers.
Yeah.
Is customers. I mean, no business functions without that. And we're in a position today where people can unlock that. That also relates to the asset management industry. And, a good friend, and people may know her from Harvard here, Kim Liu, and put her on blast here and congratulate her. But, Kim just became CEO of Columbia's endowment. It's $10 billion, And what I will say, when I raised my hand at Harvard, at a Harvard alumni, I was on the Harvard Alumni Association board and had the chance for the head of the Harvard Management Corporation to speak. And I raised my hand and asked him a question. How much do you plan to set aside for Black folks or for minorities in terms of the $32 billion endowment? And what I got was stuttering. Right? That shouldn't be a stutter. I'll tell you right now, that should not be a stutter. That should be a very coherent, cogent conversation about this is what we're doing and here is the plan. If there's no plan in place to do that, that's a problem. I can guarantee.
Do you think though? So do you think though that the reason why we are getting this stuttering often is that people are uncomfortable with the concept around quotas or set-asides and the stigmas that have become attached to that? But on the flip side, we're seeing less and less of a share of the pie.
Yeah, but even there, but it gets back to what we said before, Jill. When you start dealing with people, and I know a couple of them who've been managing these, I know the one who was managing Harvard's fund. It really comes down to, okay, I got to hit a note. I have to get a return on this money. I'm being compared to the person who's running Columbia's, Wharton's thing, the University of Pennsylvania, et cetera. They don't want to take a chance. And I've been an investor in Ariel Capital. I was there when Ariel Capital started, and and now Melanin. It's still hard getting people to give a percentage of that to Ariel Capital, and I can name 5 others because they don't have faith in them, and they're taking a chance, which really is not a chance. But one of the things I wanted to say with your question to Ron, which I think is very important historically, which is still today, which he translates to ELC. When his father got started, I was there when his father started. You had Black people in key positions, the Darwin Davises, the Tony Fays, in these corporations that were looking for the Burt Mitchells. They were looking for the Jim Lowrys. And we have to keep doing that. And he's absolutely right. We got more people in C-suite. They control bigger sums, but the concept is the same. Reach out and find out the next generation of Ron Mitchells and Burt Mitchells. And unless we do that, when you think about the power, and we do a lot of B2B. So when Ron talking about you got to have people who are going to be your customers, if you just feel the size of B2B procurement, okay, we're talking about trillions of dollars. We got to get a bigger piece, Jill, to your point, a bigger piece of that pie. We can perform. If we get the piece of the pie, we can perform and we can grow.
Yeah, this reminds me of there's this really incredible book called The American Undilemma, and it's about job hoarding. And it speaks to, it speaks entirely to this question of being in the network so you have access to jobs and opportunities. So if you have African Americans, who are in C-suite and in positions where they can steer you to that access, that's critical. But one of the things, while we're developing more critical mass, we still don't have a certain level of critical mass. And the second part is certainly the relationships or the mindsets. But you've got to have the critical mass in order to begin to steer people toward the jobs and have the mindset that job hoarding is a real issue. The whole theory of the book goes like this. And, we're using it in our own hiring and recruitment, and it's very critical in journalism now. People hear about jobs. It's too late when the job is posted. It's before it's posted. The opportunity, you find out about the opportunity on the golf course, but also you find out about it if you know someone who's in that company and you go to church with the person or have a social interaction. But one of the things that also keeps opportunity or limits us from access to some things is simply this question of job hoarding and being in a position to share information about opportunities before they become public. So you're in a competitive situation when a job isn't even posted yet. You want to be there beforehand.
Jill, let me just jump back and talk about a little bit the minority allocations within large corporations, and this is a real opportunity. I think as Black entrepreneurs, we have to think a little bit differently, and there are some unique opportunities available to us, and this is one of them. But there needs to be an understanding about. I don't think a lot of Black entrepreneurs are even familiar with the process to go through a minority supplier certification process. There are some challenges around that if you're going to raise outside capital, but you can still work through that. Right. And people like, Harriet Michelle, who was sort of seminal in doing this at a national level, in the 80s. And then you have people today like Taurus Richardson, who are, taking advantage of that and building businesses that are built around that. But one of the big challenges that those organizations, and Jim said it, there's trillions of dollars. I mean, billions of dollars being spent. The biggest challenge that they have is they can't find minority businesses that can manage the scale. Think about that.
Well, which a lot of that goes back to access to capital and resources and networks and connections. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. But there's a sort of a pathway there, and this could get to what Jim's other comment around sort of merging. The merger, right. We need to build businesses that can manage the scale of success. And the one thing that I find that is true now about entrepreneurship today, I think it's getting more challenging, actually, to be an entrepreneur, whether you're Black or white to some degree. And that's because, number one, the entry point is so easy. There's zero friction to be an entrepreneur today, particularly in technology. And the other problem is the country is dominated by 19th century railroad barons that are the tech companies today, right? And these companies have a sort of a monopolistic type of play in the world today, particularly in technology, which in order to then compete with those large companies, you have to have some moderate level of scale.
Right.
You know, you cannot battle a Facebook or a Google or a Microsoft or an Amazon, you know, unless you get to some, you know, real significant level of scale, or you build yourself to be acquired by them.
Absolutely.
Or you have that unique product. I mean,
yeah, you can go outside of the market and find
I mean,
something.
if you go to Zoom, and we're looking at Zoom.
Yeah.
We're looking at Zoom right now. Zoom didn't exist 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And you know what the valuation of Zoom is now? I
Oh,
mean, it's huge.
the opportunities
huge.
are
It's huge.
amazing. So look, you know, it's unbelievable how time has gone so quickly. So we only have a little bit of time left here. So I'm going to do some speed questions. All right. I need this to be speed, everyone.
Speed.
So I'm going to ask a couple more questions here. Susan, why is it that research and storytelling are so critical to affecting change for Black wealth building? Quick.
I don't think we don't understand the nature of those barriers if we don't have enough reporting and storytelling about what they have been historically.
Yes.
Thank you. Jim, how has the expanded definition of diversity hurt Black entrepreneurs?
I think it's hurt us in several ways. One is you open up the tent, but the size doesn't increase in terms of opportunities. Two, I think you have people who are not as sensitive as they should be to what Susan would say, 400 years of complexity of being Black in America and the complexity of our problems. And three, they don't have us as a focus. And you know, no disrespect for people who might be a white woman who has a greater comfort and more of a focus to helping other white women. God bless her, but hopefully not casting us aside. But I think that's happened. Because if you look at most of the people in these jobs, they're not Black anymore, period.
Yeah. So let's make that real clear, that we need to, we need to not have the conversation all the time about general diversity when we're talking specifically about Black. You know, and that's very clear. Ron, can you tell us how, you know, all of us who are part of this have had some level of privilege. We have some sort of Harvard affiliation, but how can that sometimes be a hindrance? And how are we maybe not able to have access the same way that our white peers are?
Again, I think, you know, as we said earlier, so part of it is what how people project on us and then how we view ourselves. You know, it's funny, as I talk to, you know, my peers, we're more risk averse than our white peers. You know, we think smaller than our white peers, and that's partially, you know, on us. What I will say, however, on the flip side is, you know, there's just not the same level of access to these sort of networks and capital. Period. End of subject. And that sort of still exists. And we have to sort of break through that. And for those of us that do have some ins to those capital, because usually it's probably like one of us do, we got to open that up to and make those opportunities and networks available to others.
Absolutely. If we're serious, and this is for everyone, again, speed, if we're serious about course correcting from where our history has been, where should we be focusing our energy and attention?
I think what Ron and I keep kind of dancing around, but I'm going to put it on straight out. I think Black people have to come together in a cohesive way, maybe not through newspapers, but in the dark room, and come up with our own plan. If we don't have our own plan, and Jill, you could run it, you could lead us. If we don't have our own plan on where we want to go, many of the issues that we're talking about will never have the impact we want to have. Once we have our own plan and we know what we're going to do over the next 5 or 10 years, that will tell us what kind of industries we want to go to, what kind of capital we need to, what kind of mergers we should have, and we should do that. Until we start leaving off, we're kind of dancing around this too. Susan danced around it with job shot. But if we only think about ourselves in the larger Black community, we will always lose. We will always lose. So we have to work together in a cohesive way, in an integrated way, or we will lose.
I want to dovetail on that because I've often thought there is really a need for a form of a Marshall Plan, which is a comprehensive investment at different points in our community, from entrepreneurship, which we're seeing as a huge issue with the Paycheck Protection Program loan related to the CARES Act and the federal stimulus. We need investment with entrepreneurs. We need investment in terms of jobs creation. And that is really being able to sit down and decide, as Jim is saying, what do we think we need to do to have this kind of strategic overhaul? And I do think this question of reparations, which is a word that folks are reluctant to use, but that word is becoming more and more mainstream now as people begin to look at the economic impact of COVID on African Americans. There are a number of books on it now, and reparations essentially is a question of redistribution and targeted investments in African American communities. Who needs to be at the table to decide? It should be folks within the community.
Yeah,
Right.
Marshall Plan, love that. And Ron, I'd like for you to focus on what is it that our allies can do, or people who fancy themselves as allies.
Yeah, I want to just tip a hit on first what we can do. And so I'm going to think much more sort of at the micro level as an entrepreneur fighting the battles every day. We need a Black YPO. And that is a series of Black executives, entrepreneurs, building businesses who come together on a regular basis to support each other. They support each other emotionally. They support each other in terms of strategically. These are very, very powerful networks, and it is very isolating to be an entrepreneur, and very isolating to be the CEO of a business, and even more so for Black entrepreneurs. And I talk about it with my buddy Cy Myers, who people don't know. This guy manages $4 or $5 billion of capital.
Amazing guy.
And but we all need to be, we're doing this sort of stuff informally, but we need to formalize that.
Yep.
Quickly, I think what we ought to do to answer your question is dealing with our people of goodwill. And it really relies on what Susan said. We have to show them what the past has been, how it's really hasn't helped America in the way now that it should have, and it's going to be a drag. But more importantly, if they don't do things differently and work with us in different ways, it's going to get worse in the future, not only for their corporations, but for America. And that's what they got to understand if they want to be serious. The only thing I would say to Ron, I think we ought to have two streams, Ron. I think we should have the Black president, the LOC. What did you call it? The Black
YPO. Yeah.
YPO. But I think we should have the Black YPO, but we also should have a given number of Blacks going into the other YPO, because that's where the deals are going.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jim. Absolutely. Too often we're creating our own circles, but we're not in the circles where the big money is and the big
The resources are. Correct.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, my brother. I had to put that out.
No, it's a good point. Now, Jim, I have to, and I'm sorry, I have to take license on this. You are from Chicago?
Yes, ma'am.
I know your family. I was there 17 years. And as I listened to you, I realized there were lots of parallel stories you were telling, and we'll have to follow up on those.
And you probably know that when I did the Chicago Minority Business Program for Harold Washington, they had a contract on mine. So
yes,
that's all a part of Chicago.
And that is in Jim's book, which I would encourage everyone to take a read. It's an amazing story. So I'm going to put something out there for our allies who are here listening and learning, that this is about action. It's great to be on a call like this and to learn and educate, but then ultimately it takes doing. And, we ask that you be open and that you come to the table, recognizing that you do not understand all of the issues. And one of the things that I find that's really important is to actually be welcome. It's not just enough to say that we welcome all people. You actually have to go to the places where Black people are and make yourself known and talk about your interest
in bringing other people into your world and into your community. So it's about more activism in terms of opening doors, not just simply saying that I'm not closing the door, but being active in opening doors. So we have so many more questions that are there. What I'm going to propose is that the panelists and I and the HAE folks will get together. We're going to write some things out and add to the information that we'll send following this, so we can get to some of these questions. Because again, we just did not have enough time for this full conversation to take place. So I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us. This was an amazing conversation. Again, it could go on for so much longer. There is going to be a follow-up in 4 months, 6 months. We'll send information on that about what has actually happened in taking action. But we want to thank all of you for joining us and for this great discussion. Don't miss the next Advancing Diversity 2020 event. Check them all out and register today at harvardae.org. If you're a Harvard alumnus or are not yet a member of this amazing community, don't wait any longer. There are lots of benefits from mentorship programs to the Harvard, the HAE Connect platform. And like I said, look out for that information. We're going to add to it so that we can continue this conversation. And more importantly, we can take action to change business as usual and advance diversity for Black entrepreneurs. Thank you so much for joining us today.